Okay, so as the title of my talk suggests, I'm going to be discussing how we are using ecological data to protect and restore pollination systems native to New England. These data come from two sources. First being my research lab at UMass Dartmouth. But equally, or certainly more importantly, the other source of data is the community through my Ecology Citizen Science project that was mentioned. And so, you know, by community, it's everything from individuals. I'm working with numerous towns across New England, conservation groups. And so my talk today is, you know, part information certainly, but the selfish part is I'm trying to recruit people to the program. And it's not just the collection of data. We're now at the point where we're starting to, we've got results and we're starting to implement different conservation strategies with some really good success over the past couple of years. So my talk is divided up into three parts. The first, you know, and I think it's the most important, is the background. What exactly is a pollination system? I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term pollinator. Immediately that most people, when they hear pollinator, think bee, but it's really not about the bees per se. You know, I could save all the bees. You know, this is a global problem. It's not just Massachusetts, it's not just New England. I could save, you know, bees worldwide and we would still have a major problem. And that's because there's a big difference between bees and the functional role that they play as pollinators. And that functional role depends on a plant, right? And as we'll see, pollination is the important thing here. That's what's generating biodiversity. It's not the bees themselves. The bees, certainly more than bees, which is why my title says more than just the buzz. You know, butterflies, flies, and beetles, hummingbirds all play an equally important role. And what in terms of pollination, and we'll see that it's really about the plant and the plant's perspective, which seems to be, for whatever reason, lost in discussions of bee decline and pollinator conservation. We'll get into some of those issues in the background. Then we're going to switch to talk about the problem. Again, there's some public misconception about what the problem actually is and therefore what we need to do to fix the problem. We'll talk about some of the, I'll show you some data to hope, you know, that hopefully will convince you that the strategy that I'm taking works in terms of protecting, conserving, restoring these systems, and then what you can do to help. So we'll start off very basic, and that is talking about the difference between a pollinator and a flower visitor. So there are a wide variety of animals that visit flowers to feed on the nectar, pollen, or both. Many of those are shown here. Globally, there are around 200,000 of these species. If the animal is visiting for nectar, the fancy term is nectarivore. If it's visiting for pollen, it's a pollinivore. So we have a wide variety of bees. There are about 4,000 bee species native to North America alone. There are various moths and butterflies. You can see down here, there are flies, beetles. Of the 200,000 species globally, only about 1,000 are vertebrates. So the vast majority of things we see feeding on nectar and pollen are insects. And so you can imagine, you know, we've got a wide variety, hundreds of different species that are looking for nectar and pollen, and they have a wide variety of flowers to choose from. So if we look at the background here, this is a typical foraging environment for one of these animals. A lot of different things in bloom at the same time in the same area. And so, you know, where do you go to get good sources of nectar and pollen? And these animals have to figure out where to go. Now, you know, because they're insects and they have a small brain, and you know, if we go back a couple of decades, people didn't even think they had a brain that functioned or could learn and remember things. People assume that it was all based on instinct. So you put out blue flowers and that attracts bees. That you put out certain flowers that smell a certain way. And although there are some species that do have these preferences, the vast majority do not. They actually learn which ones offer the best, you know, the best source of nectar, best source of pollen. The way we can figure this out in the lab, we have our monarch butterfly, touch the forelegs, it immediately sticks out its tongue, innate response, proboscis extension response, it's called, very similar to Pavlov's dogs. We then show it a stimulus. Here we show it something that to us looks yellow. We then touch the legs with the sucrose solution, so sugar sticks out its tongue. As soon as its tongue touches that sucrose, it forms an association between the color. We then show it other colors. You can see that there's no movement of the proboscis, no movement of the antenna. If we did see that, that would suggest that there's innate preference. We show the color and there's an innate response. It starts looking for food. We can show multiple colors. We see no response. We then show the test color and we see almost immediately that butterfly sticks out its tongue looking for that sugar reward. This butterfly, after just a couple of those pairings, will remember that yellow is associated with reward for over a month. So they've got really good, it's called long-term memory. They learn things very quickly, and it's not just colors. We've given these butterflies odors and shapes and combinations thereof, and they're really good. And you know, this is the same for bees. Even in flies, they're really good at what's called associative learning. So these animals then are foraging and they're using learning and memory. And I want you to remember, you know, as we move on in the talk, that it's all about the reward. It isn't about the color. It isn't about what it looks like to us. That animal is just interested in how much food it has. And so we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we're going to protect and restore these animals. Now, as they're moving through their environment foraging for nectar or pollen, if and only if they transfer pollen from one flower to another that leads to fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit, then we can change the name from flower visitor, right, to pollinator. And I want to stress that this is the transfer of pollen leading to fertilization and seed set that changes the name from a flower visitor to a pollinator. So unless we know that that animal is actually transferring pollen, we're going to give it the label flower visitor. The problem is that today everybody uses the term pollinator. Whenever you see something on a flower, immediately it's a pollinator. And certainly, you know, that may be true that it has the potential to pollinate something. Unless it's actually in the act of doing it, we can't use that label. The reason that this is so important is because from the plant's perspective, that transfer of pollen is leading to fertilization seed set. That's the reproduction from the plant's perspective. Right? So plants can't run around and find a mate, and they need to transfer their pollen to a female reproductive organ in order to complete the process. As shown here, you get pollen tube growing, you get fertilization taking place, and then we get development of seeds and fruit. So many animals, or sorry, many plants, if the pollen is transferred from one flower to another on the same plant, so let's say we have a single plant that has a lot of individual flowers, if these many plants are what's called self-incompatible, which means if they receive their own pollen, they don't get fertilization in the production of seeds and fruit. So even though we have an animal that's transferring pollen, it's not leading to fertilization, and therefore it's not a pollinator. It still has that label flower visitor. There are certainly many plant species that are self-compatible, but again, this leads to inbreeding, which is a problem because we get reduced genetic diversity. And so from the plant's perspective, they really want those animals to move the pollen from themselves to a plant that's unrelated and of the same species. And so flower visitor is the animal visiting for food. If it happens to transfer the pollen leading to the production of seeds and fruit, we then change it to a pollinator. And this is accomplished through the process of pollination. So an animal, any animal that helps to complete this process or is in the act of completing the process from the plant is called a pollinator. And it's extremely important to separate these two things out. So, you know, to drive this point home, here's an example. We have obedient plant. We have two bumblebee species. Bombus affinis is shown here at the bottom. Bombus fervidus is shown up here on the right. Bombus fervidus is going into the flower to get the nectar, which is located at the base of the flower, and in the process is making contact with the male and female reproductive organs of the plant, and again, leading to fertilization and production of seeds and fruit. Therefore, our Bombus fervidus is a pollinator. Now, our Bombus affinis, instead of going into the flower, is biting a hole at the base of the flower and robbing the flower. So stealing the nectar. The nectar, again, is located at the base. They learn where to bite so that they can go right into the nectary to grab that nectar. And so our Bombus affinis is not a pollinator. In fact, our Bombus affinis would be considered a parasite, right? It's getting something, it's benefiting, but the plant is receiving no benefit in return. In fact, the plant is receiving a cost because as this Bombus affinis takes the nectar, there's no nectar for our Bombus fervidus, and it's going to visit one flower and say, hey, there's no nectar here, and it's going to go to another plant. And so we could have thousands of Bombus affinis visiting obedient plant this way and never use the term pollinator because there's no pollination going on. We can't change the label of our Bombus affinis from flower visitor to pollinator until we introduce a plant species where it actually is acting as a pollinator. We can't hope that our Bombus affinis is going to be a pollinator in the future. We need to know that the plants that it pollinates, the plants that depend on Bombus affinis for pollination, actually exist. Similarly, if I replaced my plant with a feeder and I was able to support both of these species, by the way, Bombus affinis is the first bumblebee species on the endangered species list, even though it's not really a good pollinator of tubular flowers, it's the poster child for pollinator decline. But I could, and this is another one that's still around in Massachusetts and one that we're trying to protect, Bombus fervidus. But I could feed them and keep them going, but I still can't use the term pollinator until I introduce plants that they're actually pollinating. And when we look at the importance of these bees and butterflies and other things that act as pollinators, it really comes down to the plant. You need that plant there, and they need to complete that process of pollination for them to have their importance. Otherwise, it's just one species versus helping the plant. Right away, you're helping two species, right? When you have the plant, because it's getting reproduction and the animals are getting the food. To make things a bit more complicated or more realistic, I guess, here's the pineland golden trumpet, and here are all the things that are observed visiting this flower for nectar. Yet only 3 of them, the ones circled in green, are actually pollinators. So if I removed 3 of these 3 species, I'd still see 15 species on this plant, but not one of them is a pollinator. So the plant's not benefiting. Similarly, I could reduce all of get rid of all these other flower visitors and just keep these 3 species. And I would be maximizing reproductive output from the plant's perspective because I got all 3 of the plant's major pollinators. And so I hear this all the time that people say, well, I see a ton of bees on this plant. I must be doing a good thing. And it's quite simply not true. And you can't use the number of something that you see. We need to get down to the specific species that we're seeing. And also when it comes to conservation, we really want to focus on species that actually are in decline. And as we'll see, not everything's in decline. So we may see a lot of a common species and think that we're helping out, but really we're missing 4 or 5 species that should be there. And so we need to shift our attention and appreciating the difference between a flower visitor and a pollinator. And when should we use that term pollinator is a first step. And I have no problem with the term pollinator, just that people misuse it so much that I switched to using pollination system because it forces you to think about the plant, right? And so if people thought about pollinators from the plant's perspective, or plant pollinator system, because both are think of both of those as a unit, then we'd be much better off. Anyway, so if we go out into the field, this plant pollinator dynamics gets far more complicated because, as I mentioned, the animals are in environments where there are multiple plant species in bloom, many different flower types to choose from. And so we can think of it from the plant's perspective. There are many plants that are competing for access to pollinators. And so, sorry about that. So if we look at our flower visitor here that's going in, let's say it picked up pollen from this purple, it then has different options, right? I told you that these animals are learning the reward properties of the different flowers that they experience, and they're using them to make decisions to maximize the amount of nectar that they collect per unit time, which directly translates into their reproductive success. So that's what the animal's trying to do. Now, the plant wants the animal, in this case a bumblebee, to specialize on plants of the same species, right? So it wants our bumblebee to select option 1, which is to go from purple to purple to purple, because it's maximizing pollen transfer efficiency from the plant's perspective. Now, if our bee decides to go from the purple to this pink one to yellow, although it may be the way that this bee maximizes its nectar gain, or its energetic intake, from the plant's perspective, it's a negative thing. Why? Because the pollen is being effectively wasted. So if we're transferring pollen from this purple one to this pink one, it's like two species trying to mate with each other, and it doesn't work, right? In most cases. I mean, there are some hybrids, but for our purposes, we're effectively, this purple flowered plant is wasting male gametes. And also, when this pink flower receives purple flower, what happens is it blocks the surface of the stigma, or can block the surface of the stigma, and prevent its own pollen from attaching. And so therefore it's blocking fertilization. And so there's a cost to bees that decide to switch back and forth between flowers of different plant species, both from the perspective of male and female reproduction, from the plant's perspective. And so there are good pollinators, right? A bee that chooses option one would be a good pollinator, and if it chooses option two, it would be considered a bad pollinator, or certainly a less efficient pollinator. So it's not just about who's visiting, it's about how they're visiting flowers. This translates into seed and fruit production, and we can scale up from the individuals then, and we can start looking at populations. And so there's this back and forth between the animals and the plants. Now, as I mentioned, there are about 200,000 species of flower visiting animal that can act as pollinators to some extent. There are about 300,000 animal pollinated plant species globally, and there isn't a single animal on this side that can pollinate everything on this side, and there isn't a single plant on this side that can feed everything on this side. What we see are subgroups, right? So our red flowered plant will target a couple of species or a couple of types of flower visiting animal as their pollinator, and also our pollinators tend to focus on a subset of plants. And the plants are looking to target their good pollinators, and they also want to deter those that are just flower visitors, that like the Bombus aphanus that is visiting without paying anything back to the plant. And if we look at the plant and all of the things that pollinate it, be it good or bad pollinators, they're still pollinating to some extent. Some are more or less efficient. As long as they're pollinating to some extent, that collection is called a pollination system. So the reason that I choose pollination system then is it forces you to include the plant, because you have to have, by definition, it's the plant and all of the animals that pollinate that particular plant. And there are a wide variety of different pollination systems, right? Different plants that are pollinated by different types of animals. Here we have a bumblebee pollinated plant. We can see that the plant deposits the pollen on the back of the bee. Why? Because it's very difficult for that bee that's looking to collect the pollen to feed the larva. It's very difficult for it to groom it off of its back. And so what we see then is that there's a good fit between the flower and its most effective pollinator. It's targeting these animals, and these animals then have adaptations that help it to better exploit nectar from these particular plants. There's been this coevolutionary back and forth type relationship between the animal and the plant. Here we have a hummingbird pollination system. You can see that the pollen's deposited on the forehead of the bird. Why? Because if this plant decided to deposit the pollen on the wings of the hummingbird, it's not going to last very long. Right? It's a very efficient way to transfer pollen, because most of it will be lost. So the nectar is located at the base of the flower. The bird comes in to get the nectar. Pollen brushes up against its forehead. When it goes to another flower, this is the female part up here. As it moves into place, it will brush its forehead against the female reproductive organ, leading to fertilization and seed set. And so that's the way that the plant maximizes pollen transfer efficiency. Here we have a fly and the plant that it pollinates. We see the fly's tongue is about this long. It's extending into the flower. Here's the pollen. Here's the tube. The nectar is located at the base of this flower. And this is a highly specialized system, meaning that there's just one species, one fly species, and one plant species. If we lose the fly, the plant doesn't have a pollinator. And if we lose the plant, the fly doesn't have anything to eat. Other systems are more generalized. We certainly could have bumblebees visiting this, but they would crawl in and they wouldn't make contact with the male and female reproductive organs. And so the plants here would be trying to deter bumblebees, and they do deter bumblebees because they're less efficient pollinators, and they try to attract hummingbirds. Here's a butterfly pollination system. You can see the pollen on the proboscis, or the tongue of the butterfly, as it probes into the flower to get nectar. It's transferring pollen as it probes its tongue. You can see here the opening to the flower. So nothing can crawl into the flower. It fits very well with the long tongue, thin tongue of the butterfly. So many different types. There are fly pollinated systems, all these different animals and plants and relationships. To give you an example of a bumblebee pollination system, here's our bumblebee Bombus vagans. We've got bottle gentian. You can see that the bee bottle gentian flowers are fused. The petals are fused, so the bee has to really pry open the petals to crawl inside, and we can see our bumblebee worker crawling in, wiggling its way in to get the nectar that's located at the base of the flower. Eventually it gets to the bottom and will ingest the nectar, and as soon as it comes out of this flower, notice that it will start grooming that pollen, right there. You see it's trying to groom the pollen off to its back legs to take it back to the hive. So in this plant species, bumblebees are the only thing that has the strength to get the petals open to get in to get that nectar. Now, only about 20–30% of bumblebees actually find the nectar. So the question is, why is the plant deterring 70% of its potential pollinators? And the reason is because even though there are only a few bees that get in here, those that get in, there's so much nectar that's built up because nothing else can get in there, that they'll travel far and wide to find another bottle gentian. So this is forcing that bumblebee to specialize, which is ideal from the plant's perspective. And that's the way that the plant maximizes pollen transfer efficiency. And there are many examples of this fit between the plant and its most effective pollinator. So we need to keep this in mind. All right, so hopefully at this point you have a sense of what a pollination system is versus just a flower visitor, and pollinator and pollination system. Hopefully we can see when we use the term pollinator, we need to be thinking pollination system if we're not using the term outright. The problem is that these systems are being degraded. Now, they're being degraded both because of the decline and loss of the animals that are acting as pollinators, but I want to point out here that they're also being degraded because of the loss of the native plant, the plant partner in this process. Again, in the whole discussion about pollinators and pollinator decline, it tends to focus on bees, and the plant is virtually ignored. But you can't have a bee acting as a pollinator unless you have the plant, which is the point that I was trying to make in the first part of the talk. So if we look at the animal side of the equation first, just looking at bumblebees, so they're the black and yellow fuzzy ones that I showed you in the last video. Here are the species that are most of the species historically that were present in Massachusetts. The decline started around the late 90s, early 2000s. So what I did is I looked at museum specimens before the 90s, or before the year 2000, sorry. And then I went back to those same locations and did surveys to see if the same species were still present. And you can see in many cases like Bombus affinis, in those same locations, I didn't find any of them. And other species, I found very few of them compared to what was there historically. The same thing is true of butterflies in New England. Everything below this line is declining. Everything above is, everything below this line is declining. And then it's the same is true for plants, right? There are many plants that are either locally extinct or are very close to becoming locally extinct. And many of these plants are animal pollinated, and their main pollinators are the things that are in decline, which isn't really surprising. What I want to point out here is that although we see many cases where the yellow bars are lower than the blue bars, there are other cases where yellow, so current data suggests that the certain species have increased in number and also expanded their range. We're seeing species move to higher elevations. They weren't there historically. This is true for the bumblebees. We can see everything up here is increasing, some dramatically increasing in the butterflies, and it's the same is true for native plants. And so whatever we're doing to drive the local extinction of some species, other species are actually thriving. again, the importance of this is that when you look out on your landscape or in your garden and you see a bunch of bees, it doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? What you're seeing are common species. You're not seeing the ones that are in trouble. And the problem with this is that when people tell you to put in anything that blooms, and if you see some bees, you're doing a good thing, that's actually contributing to the problem, because what you're doing is helping the common species and not targeting the species that actually need it. And so we really need to start to think more at the species level. What species are we seeing from the animal side and the plant side? And are those species in need of help? And so, as we move through the talk, I'm going to shift to focusing our attention. We're going to shift our attention to those species that actually need it. So not everything is in decline. So why should we care about these pollination systems? And so this is another problem that I see quite a bit, and that is that this sort of one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to pollination systems. So pollination is important in two contexts. One context I'm sure everybody's aware of, and that is agriculture, right? And this is, when these declines started in 2006, public awareness of the declines started because of colony collapse disorder in honeybees and how that may impact our food supply, right? Which is certainly an important problem. But I knew that wild species like Bombus affinis was declining in the late 90s, and the public wasn't aware of that. And I was trying to bring that to everybody's attention, and nobody seemed to care. And so, the honeybee, and rightly so, in the context of agriculture, there were some issues and people became concerned. The problem is that what's going on with the honeybee is being applied to everything else, to the 4,000 other bee species, and it's just simply not true. They're completely different things. And so in agriculture, pollinator is important, pollination is important because it's providing us with food, right? 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you take, those are the numbers that are thrown around by groups like Xerces Society. But what I want to point out here is that when we talk about these pollination systems, they're artificial, right? We've created them. We've got non-native honeybees that are acting as our main pollinator. And why do we use honeybees? Because this is what we have to pollinate. Acres and acres of one thing that's available for argument's sake, 2 weeks. And so we need thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals to do all this pollinating, and honeybees in one of these hives, there are about 10,000 individuals. We can saturate the system very easily to get our crops pollinated and get the crop production that we need, to feed people. And also, we can look at things from an economic perspective as well. So other than the honeybee, there are very, very few other native bee species that act as pollinators. Bombus, there's one bumblebee. It's a common eastern bumblebee. It's one of the ones that's really increasing in number. But if we look across the board, there are only about 5% of native bee species that actually visit crop plants and act as pollinators. So if we decide to focus on the honeybee, we're really ignoring everything that's going on in terms of wild bees and protection, and we're only really going to focus on those bees that are going to help us, and we see pollinating these crop plants. So we've got a handful of species doing the pollinating. We've got a handful of crop plants that aren't native. They may have been at one point, but we've artificially selected them for various things. But a handful of plant species feeding a single species, or we could include domesticated animals for argument's sake. But this is a very limited, artificially constructed system. When we turn things to the ecological importance of pollination, things, again, change completely. What mattered back here was abundance. I need enough bees. I don't care how many species I have. I just need the numbers to do the job. Here, it's shifted now to I need to have the diversity. I need all of those pollination systems intact. Why? Because you can think of the diversity of those pollination systems, the hummingbird, the bees, different types of bees, all of those collectively are forming the foundation to our ecosystem because they're supplying food, shelter, and nest sites for animals at different trophic levels, right? So in the context of agriculture, the pollination is feeding us, it's providing clothes for us. In ecology, it's feeding hundreds of species, birds, seed-eating small mammals. And then also the things that eat those birds and small mammals. And so our pollination systems, then, we can think of them as the foundation of our ecosystem. We build our ecosystem on these plant pollinator relationships and the diversity. And as we start to erode them, at some point we're going to get to the level where, or to the point where we're starting to affect the food supply to this next trophic level. We're going to get fewer small mammals. Fewer small mammals means we're going to get fewer predatory birds and predatory animals, and we're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse. All right. So I want to point out here that the honeybee, because it's non-native, plays absolutely no role. We could remove the honeybee from North America and it won't have any effect on the ecological side of things and ecosystem functioning. In fact, some may argue that it may have a benefit in this regard because of the competition between honeybees and other native animals for floral resources. But again, in agriculture, the honeybee is extremely important, far more important than our native species. And so what I'm saying here is we need to bring things in balance. The agricultural side has received a considerable amount of attention. I'm advocating that the ecological side needs to have the same amount of attention. Now, people may argue, well, we don't care because our economy isn't driven by these by nature and diversity. And to those, I would say that actually we do depend a lot on these systems, and that is because we have what are called ecosystem services, and these are things that we get from nature for free. Carbon sequestration, soil decomposition, they're all listed here. Pest and disease management all come from healthy, diverse ecosystems. And so if we start to erode these pollination systems, so removing those plant animal interactions and the connections between the plant and those other trophic levels, we're going to lose these functions, and then we're going to have to figure out a way to replace them. And in China, we can see what will happen. And they've completely eliminated all their native pollinators, and so they're hand pollinating all their crops. They don't have any diversity, and their ecosystem services are starting to suffer, and they're going to have to figure out ways. If you can invent something to replace it, it's going to have a pretty good price tag associated with it. So, there are costs associated with this. The problem is that because people can't really see it, like you can see if crops have been affected, how much crop production you have. You can't see the effects of loss of species until it's far too late. And so, again, we want to bring more attention to this and try to help this side of the equation, this role that pollination plays, ecological role that pollination plays. All right, so what is causing the problem? There have been a number of human-introduced stressors that have been proposed. Pesticides and herbicides, depending on whether you're from the plant or the animal side. Neonicotinoids have received a considerable amount of attention, and my lab is studying and has studied all of these factors, and certainly neonicotinoid pesticides and pesticides in general you shouldn't use. Herbicides, which are getting rid of native plants, are not a good idea either. But what I want to point out is that things like disease, so new pathogens, these pathogens are coming from honeybees to native bees. And so in areas where we have a lot of agriculture, urban areas, then obviously these two factors are going to be more prominent than areas where we don't have any pesticides. And let me just say that we saw declines well before neonicotinoids got introduced, and before these pathogens, we started to see an increase in pathogen loads. And so it's clearly something else. And what these two things are doing is they're accelerating decline. Climate change, what climate change does is it puts things out of sync. So the plants are blooming and their pollinators aren't out yet, or the animals are out and the plants aren't blooming yet. So there's this mismatch that we tend to see. It's also affecting the ability of animals to overwinter because it's too warm and they need to be below a certain temperature, and that will affect their numbers as well. What I'm going to talk about, though, and I think most people would agree that this habitat change, habitat loss is the major driving factor here. And that, the problem is that this area is the least studied. And so what's going on is what's going on with these species and what do we need to do to help them, we don't have enough information on their natural history to know what to do. And so people are just guessing, and they're guessing wrong, as we'll see. And so what we're trying to do is to get data to try to figure out what's going on with these individual species. And so what do we need to do to fix the habitat? Again, when I started this work, we really didn't know. So what we did was we started to collect data to figure things out. Now, before I get there, I want to again make this distinction between saving animals, so saving the bees, and saving their functional role as pollinators in ecosystems. I'm switching the example up now from bees to hummingbirds because everybody has hummingbird feeders, and you know, you put your hummingbird feeder and you see tons of hummingbirds, and that's great. Hummingbirds are really cool to look at. But if we look at it from an ecological perspective, right, we've got our hummingbird that is using decision learning and memory and decision making, has the option between an unlimited food source and one-stop shopping versus having to visit hundreds of flowers to get the same amount of nectar, exposing itself to predators. So given the choice between plants that they pollinate, like this lobelia, like monarda, like this jewelweed, of course, these birds, you know, they're not stupid. They're going to visit the feeder. What happens, though, is by pulling them over to this feeder, these plants are not receiving pollination services. And so we are eliminating, we're saving the birds, right? They're quite happy on these feeders, but we've lost their role as pollinators. And so we've saved one species here, and we've lost not only this plant, assuming this plant needs pollination in order to persist, but think about all the seeds that we're losing, because if this is a self-incompatible plant, it needs pollen from somewhere else, all the birds that are going without food. And so here it's saving one species, here we're saving its functional role in the ecosystem and all of the connections in that ecosystem. Same thing with non-native plants. People, purple loosestrife, and I'll talk about this in a minute, hundreds to thousands of bees, none of the ones that are in trouble, by the way, but we're feeding those animals, but that purple loosestrife, the seeds, like birds don't want to nest in it, they don't want to eat the seeds, and it's taking up space that native plants would take to restore those connections. And so our non-native plants, even if we could pollinate them, we've still lost our functional role, that we need those native animal and native plant connections to preserve this ecological function. So what I started to do then, and it shocked me that others haven't adopted the same approach, because to me it seems pretty obvious that if you want to understand why something is declining and headed in the direction of local extinction, you need to understand what we're doing to affect it at different stages of its life cycle, right? And so at each stage of its life cycle, if you're a bee or a butterfly or fly, they have specific needs, and the needs differ from species to species. And so each species has its own set of needs. And so why not look at what those needs are for the species that are declining? So in butterflies, for example, there are two stages, right? There's the larval stage where they need a host plant to feed the larva. And then as adults, they need nectar plants because they're nectaring. If I provide my butterfly with all the flowers in the world, if I don't have its host plant, the butterfly, that species, is not going to persist, right? So we need to make sure that we meet all the needs. So for monarch butterflies, which is the example that most of you are probably familiar with, they need milkweed at the larval stage because they're specialists. And if we don't give them milkweed, then you can have all the butterfly pollinated plants in the world, but you're not going to get monarchs because they can't make it that far. So we need to think inclusively. For bees, right now they are overwintering. They need to find a good place to overwinter. In the spring, they need to find a place to nest. And then once they find a place to nest, they need nectar and pollen. Nectar is their source of fuel, pollen is their source of protein. They can't make new bees without pollen. All through their entire life cycle, till they produce those reproductives and then go through the dormant phase again. So they overwinter the following spring. So again, if we just put out a bunch of plants that's outside of when these bees need it, and we don't supply nesting sites and overwintering sites, the species isn't going to persist. So we need to think more inclusively, and importantly, for whatever reason, we have this one-size-fits-all approach that one bee is the same as the next bee is the same as the next bee, and that's just not true. And I knew it wasn't true from my earlier research, but what I wanted to do is get more data to demonstrate and figure out what the preferences are for these different species, the species that actually need it, the ones at risk. And so, you know, to give you another example of this one-size-fits-all approach, let's look at when these species that are in need are actually active, right? So here are the flight times for butterflies. You can see that this one peaks in July, this one's peaking in June, some of them are peaking later in August and September. This bee species that's in decline, so you probably have trouble seeing this, I apologize, but this is June, right? Here's its abundance. After June, this species isn't even around. So if we start planting for pollinators and have things that bloom in mid to late June, we've completely missed the species life cycle, and it will starve and we won't have this species. And that's why we see it feeding on willow, which blooms when it's actually active. Then we have something like Bombus fervidus, where it comes out in the spring, late spring, and it persists all the way through to late August. We need to make sure that this species has nectar sources all the way through, and plants are only blooming. So the different colors here are showing you different plant bloom times. We can see this plant blooms here. Ooh, this plant blooms and then it's done. We have to have another plant, another nectar source for this bee. Otherwise, it's going to not have fuel, and bees can survive about 24 hours without a nectar source, and then they're dead. So pollen, they can last a little bit longer, but they can't make new bees. So unless we have a plan where we have things blooming for this, that this species likes, then we're not going to be able to help it. All right. So with these life cycles, then we can start to look at, well, what are plant species that, when are they most in need? And it turns out that in the spring, and when I say spring, I mean as soon as the snow melts. So willow is one of the most important species in the spring. There are others like cherry and other fruit trees that are really important, but willow, male willow, has nectar and pollen. So if we just look at willow alone, all the threatened bee species can visit it for nectar and pollen. We then have all these butterflies that visit for nectar, and one butterfly uses willow as a host plant. And so just by planting willow alone, we're helping all these different species. We're restoring connections between the plant and native plant and all of these animals that are at risk. Okay, so specifically then, what do, I'm going to shift the focus now to bumblebees. What do our bumblebees need? So these are the black and yellow fuzzy ones. They're shown down here, and there's some other species shown here. And our bumblebees come in different sizes, and importantly, they come in different tongue lengths. Some have short tongues, and the ones that are in trouble tend to have longer tongues. And so if we look at our short tongue species, they tend to visit things like this goldenrod, composite flowers, where their short tongue allows them to get access to the nectar. So we can see this is Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, poking around. You can see it just has to walk along and start getting nectar. Goldenrod has so much activity because it's a good source of nectar for everything with a short tongue, and a lot of things have short tongues. Now, we also have our long tongue species that will never be observed on goldenrod. Why? Because their long tongue gets in the way. So here's jewelweed. The nectar is located at the base of this long spur. Here's Bombus fervidus, and it's able to put its head in and stick its tongue and wrap it around to the base of this to get all the nectar. Our short tongue species could never compete with Bombus fervidus for nectar because they can't get to the bottom of the nectar because their tongue's too short. But at the same time, our Bombus fervidus, its long tongue is very inefficient on these simple flowers. And so it gets in the way, and they can't compete with short tongue species for nectar. So they're tuned to these long tube flowers. And so I can have all the aster and goldenrod in the world, but unless I have jewelweed, I'm not going to be able to help this species. All right, so we start to see, just based on tongue length, we can make predictions about how things should separate out. And so what I did was I went out and looked for these connections, right? Here are my initial study sites. Right now, I've got, through my study sites and through people putting in habitats, I've got, this map of Massachusetts will be filled with color. Not a lot on the North Shore, so, it's again, my recruitment part of my talk. But anyway, so here's one of my study sites, Breakneck Hill. It's 40 acres in Southborough. And what I did was walk up and down transects once a week from March through October, IDing the bee, what behavior, what plant was it interacting with, different things about the bee. Was it a queen worker or male? Collected all those data and then analyzed them. But at the same time, when I started this, it was just myself and one grad student, and I needed to cover all of the state because I found some very interesting data at a few sites. And so I thought, well, how am I going to collect a lot of data over a short period of time? And I thought, oh, well, there are a lot of people that are interested in bees and bee decline and pollination. And so why not recruit them? And so I developed the Beecology Citizen Science Project. Initially, it just had one goal, and that is for people to help me to collect those data on bee flower interactions so I could figure out what the species that need actually like to eat. But now I've added 2 more goals, and I'm training people on how to assess the habitat quality for these native pollination systems. So not just bumblebees, but the habitat in general for pollination system diversity. And thirdly, using the data, now we have enough data that we can actually, I've got a plant list that I'll talk about in a minute, to start putting plants in the ground to restore habitat. And we're seeing success in just a single year based on this approach. And as I said, the bee declines have been known since the early 2000s, 2006. And I've seen a lot of pollinator gardens, and I've never seen, or very rarely do I see these bee species in trouble. And now we start to put in the plants that they like, and guess what? We're starting to see them. It's not a shock, but so we're starting to expand this part of the Beecology project. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the talk. But to help collect, we've developed, I'm collaborating with 2 faculty at Worcester Polytechnic Institute that are on the CS side of things. We developed this phone app. It's a web app, which means you don't have to download it. You just go to the website. It temporarily stores information on your phone. It helps you to ID bumblebees. We've now teamed up with iNaturalist. We're going to be able to do butterflies and basically anything that's visiting a flower, so you can ID the plant and also the bees or butterflies through iNaturalist, which will be deployed in spring 2022. So really looking forward to that. But the data then are sent to the database, and you can go to the Beecology website, which is down here, and you can look at the data from your area. You can, we've got a whole bunch of different visualization tools, and we're developing high school curriculum around it and a whole bunch of other things that I don't have time to talk about today. But we've got thousands of entries from beecologists to help to complement the data that I've collected. And so the data that I collected, myself and grad students, there are very clear patterns across sites. So this is just looking for July. I saw at least one bumblebee on 25 different plant species. Right? But if we look at what the individual bumblebee species, which are shown down here, actually do, we can see that over 50%, sometimes over 60, 70, 80% of their visits are on just 2 plant species. So Bombus, and not surprisingly, if we divide them up into the short, medium, and long tongue species, there are general patterns, right? The long tongue bees are on things like vetch and red clover, which have long tubes. The short tongue bees are on goldenrod and milkweed, right? Which isn't surprising as well. What is surprising is that when we look at within groups, so here within the medium tongue, they're all the same size, same tongue length, yet we see that this species prefers purple loosestrife and vetch, whereas this one really likes bush honeysuckle and milkweed. In the long tongue bees, the same thing. We see these differences between species. So all these plants are available to the bees at the same time, and all those bees are present at the same time, yet we see this resource partitioning. It's not because of tongue length, it's due to other preferences, probably the chemistry of the nectar, and I'm collaborating with someone from Cornell and a group from Germany to figure out exactly what's driving these preferences. And again, that's a whole other talk. So this is for nectar. Now, if we look at pollen, this is the same site, same month. All these bees are present. We see that out of the 25 plant species available, only 2 were plant species where the bees collecting pollen. You can see them actively collecting pollen. It's a very obvious behavior, and that's meadowsweet shown here and bush and St. John's wort shown here. So what this tells us then is that they're all trying to get the same thing for pollen. As I said, they need pollen as a source of protein to make new bees. So there's very strong competition for pollen. And so with increased competition and a limited resource, you're going to get what's called ecological winners and losers. Some species are going to be really good, get out early, get all the pollen, and then some species are going to be without pollen. And because they need pollen to make new bees, it's going to start to affect the population. When we look at the Beecology data, and again, this font's kind of small, and I apologize, but here's Bombus for the 3 bumblebee species that are in trouble or at risk, Terricola, Furvitus, and vagans. So I showed you Furvitus and vagans, and you can see red clover, and you can see vetch, right? So the Beecology data, even though they're collected independently by Beecologists, the same patterns are emerging. So when you see, in urban areas, the same patterns as you're seeing on conservation lands and more rural areas, clearly there's a pattern and there's a preference there. And so what I did then was take all those data and look at the native plants, right? Because again, we're trying to restore the connections with native plants. And I created a plant list that specifically support the bumblebee species at risk, which are circled here. And then I also went into the literature and looked at the butterfly species at risk and other bee species that are at risk, and tried to find information on their preferences and include it in this master list. Which is, again, I can send you a PDF and just send me an email. I'll have my email at the end of the talk, and I'm happy to give you this list or work with you on plant suggestions. Divided up into good pollen plants and nectar plants, short and long tongued bees. You can look at plants, got bloom time, different soil and lighting conditions, and everything that you need. So and so that's how we've used the data to create these lists. Now, the next phase then, once we have the data and we have the list, is, okay, so let's start putting these plants in the ground to see what happens. And that's where we're going with this. But just to jump ahead a little bit, here is just one example of what we would put in to support these species at risk, right? We'd start in the spring with wood betony and lupin, which they really like. Then moving into Penstemon hirsutus and Penstemon digitalis, to Monarda, to Prunella, and then to jewelweed or purple giant hyssop. So here are the nectar plants. Just putting these in would support the species at risk through the year. Then for pollen, we start with our willows, male because male has pollen. Carolina and Virginia are native roses. Meadowsweet, St. John's wort can be put in. Purple flowering raspberries, another really good one. And so that would get us pollen through the season as well. So this collection of plants, starting with a square meter of plant material or more, is enough to help to support these species in terms of their nectar and pollen needs through the season. I had mentioned to you that there are a lot of pollinator gardens and pollinator lists out there. And so how do they differ from what the list that I just showed you? And I know you couldn't read it, but I'll point out a couple of differences. First of all, I'm focused on species at risk, and I'm focused on native plants. The other plant lists out here, and this is just an example from pollinator.org, you can see that this one size fits all approach, right? Bumblebees as one thing, digger bees, leafcutter bees. Meanwhile, there are 50 bumblebee species in North America alone. And then going through the plants, there are a lot of non-native plants here. So here we're feeding the bees. We're not conserving its functional role as a pollinator. And what's interesting here is that clover isn't checked, yet red clover is basically what's keeping Bombus furvitus and Bombus vagans from becoming locally extinct, yet it's not even checked off here. Rose is a major pollen source, yet it's no different than something that they don't even really visit that much, like goldenrod. They don't visit at all. And so what I'm doing then is just, again, trying to focus things down using data to figure out what they need, and then we're going to make that available to the animals so that we know that they're getting enough to eat, and then we're going to focus on their nesting sites and their overwintering sites. Here's a couple of examples of bees buddies, bee mixes. It's been a major marketing tool, and to be honest, all it's doing is contributing to the problem. We look over here, I told you that our long-tongued bumblebees and other bees are in trouble. All of these plants, most of them aren't really native. They're cultivars. I'll talk about the problem with that in a minute. But none of this is going to help any of the species at risk. Similarly, over here, there are a couple of plants. Monarda's good, the lupin's good that I mentioned, but there are no pollen plants here. And this is only a couple of weeks out of the entire season where we're going to have food, nothing early spring that they would feed on. So it's, again, it's just using data to figure out what they need and then using that to create these lists and to change the habitat. All right, so I mentioned that the cultivars are not a good thing. They are not the same as straight species. And so what's the problem, right? Why can't we put in cultivars? So this is some data from Annie White from the University of Vermont. I've seen the same things that Annie has seen. It's just I didn't formally test them as she did, and she has some really good figures. And so I'm using some of her information. So we can see that we have a wide variety of things where we have the straight species and the cultivar. So we're going to focus on Echinacea. Here's the straight species, and here are the cultivars. Cultivars, we breed them to make them more cold hardy. We may breed them because we like the look of them. And so what we want to do is we want to shift things to the perspective of the animal and specifically the animals that need it. So this is called, in German, it's called Umwelt, right? Looking at things from the perspective of the animal. I teach an animal behavior course. The first day of lecture, I said, look, you have to assume the role of the animal here. They have sensory systems and abilities that you don't have. So we can't assume that if we like something that the animals are going to like it, or if we think things are some way that the animals are going to think the same. And so what she did was she put out the straight species in the cultivars and looked to see what was visiting. And sure enough, we look at all bees. Here's the straight species, and here are the cultivars. Here's bumblebees. They don't really even touch the pink one over here. So the color of the bar matches up the color. This is the straight species, and then the cultivars. Butterflies and moths, the same thing. Other native bees, same thing. Even honeybees don't prefer the cultivars. So why is it that they don't prefer? Well, the answer is quite simple. I told you it's all about the nectar and pollen content. And when you are breeding for one thing, you have to give something else up, and more often than not, it's nectar. So here's Lobelia cardinalis, the straight species. Here's a hybrid cultivar. It looks identical to us. Well, to me anyway, it looks very similar anyway, maybe not identical. But to the bird, it's very different. Here's the nectar content in the straight species. Here's the nectar content in the hybrid cultivar. The bird is going to visit one of these flowers and completely reject the flower altogether and try to find something else. And so, and I've been burned many times by nurseries telling me it's a straight species. I put it in the ground, nothing visits it. I then can measure the nectar and I see there's no nectar, and ask them, and they're like, oh yes, well, it's a cultivar, but it's really like a straight species. And then I tell them, well, no, actually it isn't like a straight species from the perspective of the animal. So so it's better just to avoid cultivars altogether and focus on straight species. So what is it that we need to do? And again, this is where it's data collection from your perspective as a citizen scientist or an informed steward of the land. The first thing you want to do is take an ecological inventory. What exactly do you have on your landscape? So when you go out, do you have the species at risk or don't you? And that's both from the animal side and the plant side. More often than not, you're going to see you've got a lot of vetch and red clover, and you're going to have these pollinator species at risk. But remember, we're feeding the bees when we have these species. What we want to do is introduce the native plants that they visit and pollinate, because these native plants are the connection to the other trophic levels. And so if we see that we have vetch and red clover, what we want to do is slowly introduce, let's say, the penstemon hircidus. Once the penstemon hircidus gets to the point where the resource is the same as the red clover, we can then remove the red clover. So we're not saying to go in and wipe everything out, because they won't have food. And, it's this gradual introduction of the native plant. And so just to give you an example, this is Breakneck Hill in Southborough. As I mentioned, 40 acres. There's a wet area down here that was covered with purple loosestrife. It had some bush honey, native bush honeysuckle, the meadow sweet, We've got willow in this area, and we've got native rose over here. Now, they mowed this every year in August to the ground. And, in the spring, you see what comes up. And it's very difficult when you mow, and especially if you mow in the spring, you're not going to see a lot of the native plant material that's actually there. So one thing you can do is selective mowing. So you mow an area and you let one other area grow up. And so I told them, I saw that there was some willow, and I said, don't mow this area for a spring. And sure enough, didn't mow. The willow, not only did it grow up, it bloomed, and it was covered with bees and butterflies and a whole bunch of other things that weren't there for the years before when the mow was going on. Letting it mow, leaving the bush honeysuckle for a year, tripled the population size and also increased the size of the plant. The meadowsweet expanded, and also this native rose, just mowing around it, there's now a very large population of native rose. So, this is how you determine what's actually in a particular space. The other is that you want to start to look at what is in bloom. Do you have a wide variety of flower shapes? Do you have those tubular flowers, right? So you can take a general inventory, and if you're covered with, goldenrods and asters, you might want to think about introducing some things with more tubes, like the jewelweed, things that the longer tongue bees that are at risk would actually prefer to visit. Also, how many non-native versus native plants do you have on the landscape, and how could you shift that ratio so that the natives are more dominant? Coupled with this, that is, to take an inventory, you have to learn what the species you're trying, like what are these species at risk and what do they look like? Again, you can't go out and just start seeing a bunch of bees and butterflies and think that you have a healthy landscape. I offer workshops, many workshops a year on how to ID these bees, how to use the app. I've got videos on the website on how to do this. And so for the bumblebees, it's pretty straightforward. I'm happy to give a workshop next spring, for example, to teach a few of you how to ID so that you can go out and you can assess. And then not only just assess, but what's really important to me is when you make changes, going back and seeing that those changes made a difference. Don't trust me. Go out and see the species at risk on your landscape that weren't there before. It's very empowering. And again, this is going on at, on conservation lands across the state, different towns that I'm working with already. Just as an example, in Southborough, they put in some of the plants on the list. One of the first visitors was a Bombus fervidus, and all of the volunteers that got together that fall, started to do a seed sow workshop, a seed swap, and planted these up the next year on their property. And they're starting to see those positive results as these bees start to move into their backyards. I have an ID sheet again to help on this, and I'm happy to send you a PDF or as I said, to give you a workshop if you're interested. Okay, so how should you change things? Then again, another example from Breakneck. I mentioned that there's a lot of purple loosestrife down here. Now, I surveyed this land for 3 years before we started to do anything about this purple loosestrife, and I saw very few vagans and fervidus, never any on purple loosestrife. I saw a few on vetch and red clover. Decided to remove the purple loosestrife, and after just 2 years of removing the purple loosestrife, all of these native plants came up. This is Mimulus. You can see some of the dead loosestrife in the background. The first visitor was vagans, which is this one in trouble, and this is Bombus fervidus in trouble on the same plant. And now, when I say that I've seen 1 or 2 individuals, remember, I'm surveying once a week for an entire summer, and I'm seeing 1 or 2 individuals, never on the same plant at the same time. Yet here, as soon as that Mimulus came up, that's one of their favorite plants, and it's like a magnet. We started to see them on the property. All these other species as well. There was some swamp rose that came up, jewelweed, all these native plants are coming up. So just by removing 1 non-native species, loosestrife, we've got 6, 7 species of natives that are replacing it. Okay, so I'm not sure why I inserted this slide here, so we'll just move along. So how should I change things? So this, I get this question all the time about honeybees. And as I said, agriculturally speaking, honeybees are extremely important and should be present. Ecologically speaking, not so much, because they are competitors. And just to give you an example of this, this is Monarda fistulosa variety rubra shown here, okay? Here we have, in black, we have the last week of July. What did I observe? So I saw on this rubra quite a few Furvitus, vagans, this other bumblebee, Gricicolus, and Bimaculatus, which are two common species, but two species at risk. I also saw a few of these carpenter bees, which are native. And carpenter bees, like Bombus affinis that I talked about before, bite holes at the base of the flower. So these are long tubes matched up with our long-tongued bees. But this one's nectar robbing. And so it has a short tongue. It starts biting holes. And what happened was that in just a 1 week period, there were enough holes that honeybees figured out that this was a good source of nectar. And as you know, honeybees recruit. And so we went from a couple of individuals, possibly in this week, to over 100 individuals in one observation period, right? So I'm in there for 15, 20 minutes observing everything in a small cluster of plant. We've got over 100 honeybees versus none. So all of these species got pushed off to back to vetch and red clover because they weren't going to compete with the honeybees because there were so many. Looking at even common or other plant species, you know, it's a common trend. The honeybees are 100 to 1 and 100, a 10 to 1 with the most common bumblebees. So on the same observation period on mountain mint, there are 100 honeybees, 12 common bumblebees and no at risks, and on goldenrod, it's the same. So the take home here is that, you know, putting the honeybees on agricultural land thinking that you're helping the environment is absolutely false, right? And that, for whatever reason, that agenda is being pushed. But I'm here to say that if your goal is conservation, you're focusing on native animals and plants, that putting honeybee hives in that environment is not helping, okay? Certainly, you know, and I'm working with a lot of beekeepers and a lot of farms to keep both honeybees on agricultural land and then also increasing diversity, biodiversity on these agricultural lands. And there is a way that both can coexist, certainly, but this notion that you're helping by putting them onto conservation lands is not true. And I have lots more data. This is just one example that was the most dramatic, where in a 1 week period, they went from good numbers of these species at risk to none of them, and they got pushed. And I mark individuals so I know where they go, and they got pushed out away from this area onto vetch and red clover, which presumably is a less beneficial resource, because otherwise they would have been visiting it while this Monarda was in bloom. Okay. So if you've got limited space and limited budget, then you want to focus on what I call high impact plants. Those are native plants you can put in where you're maximizing the number of things that are benefiting. And it's not just looking at it from the pollinator perspective, but also things that are using the plant in general. So our native roses, as I said, pollen's great source of pollen for all the bumblebee species in decline, but native rose is also a host plant for the apple sphinx moth. The larvae then are, all of these birds will feed on the larval stage. And then we have things like eastern whippoorwill, which would feed on the adult stage. Then we have the products of pollination, and all these birds are able to use the products of pollination as a food source. So all of these species, just by putting in one native rose. And it doesn't just have to be showy to help. Native grasses, birds, seed-eating birds love native grasses. A lot of butterflies use native grasses and sedges as host plants. And then also rodents use them as nest sites. Now, why is this important? And the reason is, first of all, because rodents are a source of food for many bird species that are in trouble, but also bumblebees do not make their own nests. They use nests. We think that they use abandoned rodent nests, and we have a lot of good data to support this. And so if you are mowing or reducing the amount of native grasses that you have, you're reducing rodent populations, fewer nest sites for our bumblebees, that can contribute to species decline. So we want to big blue stem switchgrass, and there are a bunch of them on my list that would be really good to promote in an environment, certainly better than the non-native grasses. Also, the nesting habitat. So we've got ground and stem nesting bees. We don't want to mow because Bombus fervidus, our bumblebee species in trouble, likes to nest in tall grass. If you mow, there are no rodent nests. There's no tall grass. When the grass is really tall over the winter, it forms these tufts. The bees are using the cavities made by these tufts of grass as nest sites. So, people ask me, well, when should I mow or cut back my plants? And the answer is you don't cut back your plants, because you've got to, these are nest sites for a lot of stem nesting bees. And these bees need these nest sites for 2 years. So it's not good to leave them for a year and then cut them. And then, we want sand and a sandy soil, for our ground nesting bees as well. All right, so just finishing here on a positive note about making a difference. As I mentioned, I've got a lot of groups working with me to put in these habitats. I put in a number myself. Here are a couple of examples in Dartmouth. I've got, here's the site in Dartmouth. Here's the site in Southborough. Putting in plants and plugs. That's one of the positives come out of COVID, is that there are a lot of volunteers with time on their hands, and even though it was hot and dry, they were able to get these plants established. The very first year that those plants were put in, they started to bloom. And guess what? All of these pictures down on the bottom here are the bumblebee species at risk visiting plants in these habitats. So the success was pretty much immediate, which was shocking to me, and it's very exciting. So I'm looking to expand these habitats out. Year 2, things that didn't bloom in year 1, things like showy goldenrod. Here's an example of Bombus vagans queen that's on showy goldenrod. Our hairy beard tongue. This is our Penstemon hircidus. This is a Bombus vagans this year at Dartmouth site, and this is Bombus fervidus down here. Where is she? Right there, visiting. So a lot of success continuing into the second year, and we're starting to expand sites, and hopefully, you would like to participate in the project and help our conservation efforts. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'd like to thank everybody on this page, and this, I'm sure I could have 3 slides with people that I should be thanking. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Dr. Gegear, thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and there are several questions in the chat. We have about 7 minutes.
Yeah, I apologize,
but that's all right. But it's definitely time to get to some of these questions. And Peter, I think you are managing that because you have better access to chat than I do.
Oh, one of the questions is, how did you remove the purple loose strife from the location ad?
Yes, so excellent question. So it was hand pulled. There were a couple of larger populations. One population was removed by hand, and then as I was trying to get the beetle, so there was another site where they effectively used the beetle, but the decision was made to use the chemical to remove the loose stripe the second year, and I cringed because it looked like a bomb went off. But I'll say that, the following year is when all of these native plants came into bloom and there was no loose strife. And I saw those connections forming and supporting those species at risk. And so, I'm now torn. I would go the route of hand pulling and beetle before I would use the chemical, but that's what was done at that site.
Very interesting. This is, I think, an amalgamation of 2 different questions. Let me look right now. When you are considering where to put native plantings, it's sort of based off of Mike Dyer's question. Is this something that you think would be valuable in woodlands, or is this something that really is most important in pollinator meadows or fields?
Right, so good question. So let me just say that all native plants serve an important function in native animals and as a part of like a connected system. So I'm focusing on the plant pollinator systems. So, deep in the woods, these systems, we don't tend to find a lot of these systems. I'll say that in the spring, tree pollen and nectar is their primary source of food. So in terms of forest, that plays a role, but this is more open. I would say more open habitats is what I'm targeting for systems, just because that's where the plants are that they're pollinating. So it would be more on the meadow side, or sort of a transitional land, because there are a lot of shrubs as well.
Okay. We took down, so we can, see, we took down a lot of the contact information you had. If someone was more interested in finding out a little bit more about the research, where would they go to find some of the, images you shared, or maybe any of the data?
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so am I still sharing or not?
No, you're not.
I'm not sharing. Sorry. All right, let me share. You see that? Down here in the bottom.
Okay.
Is my email address. And then the lab website, that's where my plant list is, and other information on some of the butterfly and other bee species in decline. And then beecology.wpi.edu. That link, if you go to the Gegear Lab website, there's a Beecology tab, and that will take you to the Beecology site. So with just going to my lab website, you've got all the information there. And if you have any problem with anything, just email me if you have any specific questions at the email address there.
Wonderful. And we have I'm seeing if there's any new questions. We have a question that was one of the first questions. How are you imagining the future of pollination and agriculture kind of going hand in hand? Do you think some of these big agricultural producers will try to resort to something more natural, or are they focusing more on sort of artificial created, human created technology?
Yeah, so for the larger agricultural systems, I don't think that there's going to have to be a major change for them to start to think about diversity again, because when you can bring in 1 million honeybees to do the pollination, there's no real incentive to focus on diversity at that scale. But certainly larger or smaller areas, organic farms I'm working with, where there are enough, you can support enough of the natives with the honeybee if you need to get the pollination done, but then you're able to extend the native plants through the rest of the season to support the connections. So there are certainly plants that honeybees would favor, that some of these species at risk would not. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to maximize both worlds, if you will. But the large agriculture is still using pesticides, and they don't want anything on the landscape but their crop plant, and so that's a tougher one.
That seems to cover most of the questions we have in our chat. I just want to say thank you. This was super interesting and definitely very informative. So I'm very happy I was able to, learn from you. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gegear. Extraordinary. And I hope members will think about joining Beecology, because it sounded like you were looking for some data from the North Shore, which you didn't have yet.
I am, yes. And I am, hoping to form partnerships. So if you had some thoughts about, these systems and it's really native biodiversity, I'm happy to meet with you and discuss options if you want to. So just send me an email and we can chat.
Well, fabulous. So thank you, Dr. Gegear. Let's all give Dr. Gegear a big hand.